Yeah. Thanks, Kathy. I appreciate that. I love that you said they're very endearing because that's what I say as well. Bumblebees are one of my favorite animals, and they're a really easy sell when you're trying to get people to fall in love with insects, with bees. Bumblebees are a really great starter bee because they're like flying puppies. They're adorable. So as Kathy said, my name is Amy Dolan. I work for the Xerces Society, and I am my title there is Endangered Species Conservation Biologist, and my role is the Mountain States Bumblebee Atlas Coordinator. I will definitely be sharing some more about that project in this presentation tonight. The Mountain States Bumblebee Atlas covers the states of Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and Nevada. And so I am based in Grand Junction, Colorado. I moved here last June to start this Atlas project, to launch the Atlas. So the Atlas launched in June. I started my job in June, and we've had a great first year. Before that, I was living in Boise, Idaho, teaching middle school science. I've spent most of my career as a middle and high school science teacher, and I I went back to school when I was in my 30s to get my master's degree at Montana State, a master's in entomology. And that was happened because of an entomology elective that I did with students when I was teaching in Arizona. I had a group of high school students. We found an entomologist at the local 4-H chapter, and we all learned a lot about entomology. And apparently I got hooked more than all of them. And I'm like, I'm going to go back and learn more about this. So I went back to school and got my master's degree. And that's where I started to dive into this world of bumblebees. And just have kind of been doing teaching and bumblebee work ever since. And when this position came up with the Xerces Society to be the coordinator of this Mountain States Bumblebee Atlas, it seemed like a perfect situation for me because I liked outreach, I like to teach, and I love bumblebees, of course. So here is our chance. I'm going to, okay, we're good. All right. So I just want to start, if you're not familiar with the Xerces Society, just share a little bit about our organization. We are a science-based nonprofit. The home office is based in Portland, Oregon, but we have almost 100 employees all across the US, and we are all doing work to protect and support invertebrates. So it's all about invertebrate conservation. I am part of the bumblebee team at Xerces. I love that I work for an organization that has a bumblebee team. We have a Western monarch team, we have a freshwater mussel team, we have a firefly team, we have people that are doing outreach and education, people working on advocacy, people that are researching pesticides and trying to limit those effects, people building habitat. And so just so much great work that Xerces does, all with this mission of protecting that invertebrate life that sustains us. We are a member-supported organization. If you are a member of Xerces Society, I thank you so much for your support. If you are not yet a member, I just encourage you to go to xerces.org and see all of the resources that are there. The Xerces Society is known for creating really great materials that are mostly free and available to the public. There's a whole resource library with PDFs that are beautifully created that can teach you about different invertebrates and about building habitat to support them. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to do that. But tonight is really all about bumblebees. So I'm excited to get to share about these, like I said, one of my favorite animals. I'm gonna go over and talk about the importance of bumblebees, their diversity, biology and unique adaptations that bumblebees have, concerns about like conservation concerns. So why are we concerned? Like what's causing our concern? And then what we can do to help, which will include some information about the Bumblebee Atlas project. So starting with why are bees important? And I'm speaking to the Native Plant Society, so I know that you know why bees are important. The answer is that they're important pollinators. This is something that I loved teaching to middle school students, like what pollination is. There were students that were allergic to pollen and they'd heard of pollination, but they didn't really realize that it was plant reproduction, that plants can reproduce sexually, that pollen contains male reproductive cells and they need to get moved to the female parts of the flower in order for seeds to be created. So that's something I loved blowing middle schoolers' minds with those facts. But that's what pollination is. It's helping plants to reproduce. Many plants, as I'm sure many of you know, can be pollinated by wind or water. Plants can self-pollinate, but most of our plants benefit from or even require a pollinator, an animal pollinator to help with that. Animal pollinators can be birds like hummingbirds, they can be mammals like bats, but most of our pollinators are insects. And that can be, there's a lot of different insect pollinator groups, from moths and butterflies, flies, beetles, wasps, and then of course bees. And so why does this matter? What's at stake in our investment in pollination and pollinators? A lot of times when we think of pollination, we automatically think of food, because food is important for us, and that is kind of what we as humans get out of it. I've heard people say that without pollinators, we'll starve to death. We won't have any food, and that's not exactly true. But without pollinators, we'll be missing out on a lot of the foods that we really enjoy, like some of our fruits, like our berries and nuts and things like that. 1 in 3 bites of food we eat is courtesy of insect pollination. And then on a larger scale, just thinking about all of the plants that are wild plants in the world, that I appreciate when I go on a hike, because we visit different ecosystems and are wowed by different things, or when we go out on a quest to find a really rare plant, which probably has a rare bee that pollinates it, knowing that 90% of the world's wild plants depend on pollinators to reproduce. And while oftentimes we think about just that food aspect, the human-centric aspects of pollination, thinking bigger scale in ecosystem level, pollinators are really important in ecosystems. They provide food and habitat. So thinking about the seeds and the berries and the nuts that are produced by different plants, those are food for small mammals, for birds, all the way up to grizzly bears. I met and was working with a grizzly bear biologist in Glacier National Park when I was doing my master's work in Montana. And she has become a bumblebee scientist because she figured out that connection from the bumblebees that pollinate the huckleberry plants, the huckleberries that the grizzly bears rely on. In these ecosystems, everything is connected. And thinking about without plants being able to reproduce, a lot of the habitats that other animals rely on would no longer be there. So thinking about like something like a small deer being able to take shelter in plants. That plant reproduction is often courtesy of insect pollination. And then sometimes the pollinators themselves, like this little caterpillar here, is food for wildlife. So when we think about the ecosystem, we think about food webs and food chains. Without the pollinators, we would be missing a lot of those links. They're essentially important. Because of that, we consider pollinators keystone species. Every ecosystem on Earth would be drastically different if we didn't have them. So they are really important. Thinking about those different pollinators, we want to focus in on bees. Bees are the most efficient pollinators, and that's because of this word intentionally. They are intentionally collecting and transporting pollen. Bees eat pollen for protein and other nutrients. They drink nectar for carbohydrates and other nutrients, both as adults and as larvae. And so when bees are out on flowers, most of the time what we're seeing, like actively collecting pollen, those are female bees that are actively collecting pollen and nectar to take back to their nest to feed their offspring. So because they are intentionally collecting and transporting pollen, where many other animals are visiting flowers to drink the nectar, they are carrying a lot of pollen, and therefore they are accidentally leaving pollen behind on every flower that they visit. So bees are really good pollinators. Every female bee has pollen catching hairs or pollen carrying structures. So on bumblebees and honeybees, that's something called a corbicula, a pollen basket that's on the hind leg. This is in a concave section. It's really shiny when there's no pollen there. It's concave and it's surrounded by these bristly hairs. And the bumblebees and honeybees, they'll pack their pollen and nectar together into this ball and they'll carry it on their back legs. That's something that's unique to those types of bees. Other bees, like mason bees and leaf-cutting bees, they have these pollen-carrying hairs on the underside of their abdomen called scopa. And so as they land on flowers and gather pollen on their bodies, they'll push it down and groom it down to those pollen-carrying hairs. Other bees, like digger bees and sunflower bees, longhorn bees, they have specialized hairs on their back legs where they can carry their pollen. I love bees like this. They look like they're wearing fancy little leg warmers. And so when they get pollen on their bodies, they'll push it down there to their legs. But then there's some bees that are kind of tricky, like this in the last picture. She doesn't even look like a bee because she doesn't look hairy. It almost looks like a little wasp. And that's because her pollen carrying structure is internal. Bees in this genus will actually swallow the pollen and nectar and regurgitate it when they get back to the nest. But bees are all out there. They are vegetarians. They're feeding on pollen and nectar and then intentionally collecting pollen and nectar and accidentally doing this important work of pollination while they do that. In the world, there is 20,000 different species of bees, and that's like minimum. We know that there's a lot of species of bees that have not yet been discovered, many species that haven't yet been described, and taxonomists are doing a lot of work to really figure out just the differences between species. There's a lot of work to be done. In North America, 3,600 is an estimate of how many bee species there are in North America. Again, we know that there are some that are not yet discovered and some that are not yet described. And over 1,100 in Utah. This is a really great place to learn about and look for and study native bees. A lot of our native bees really like hot, dry environments. The desert Southwest is just a hot spot of bee diversity. And so having some desert landscapes in Utah really helps. And then when we think about bumblebees, having the mountains really helps. So this is just a really awesome place to learn about and to study and to look for native bees. When we think about bees kind of in the grand scheme of all the animals in nature, scientists like to classify things to make everything orderly and easy to study. So bees are part of order Hymenoptera, which means they're most closely related to wasps and ants and sawflies. There are 7 families of bees found in the world. One of them is only known from Australia. So there's 6 families of bees found in North America. They're pictured here. And all 6 of these can be found in Utah. But we're going to zoom in on bumblebees. And when we talk about bumblebees, we're talking about bees that are in the family Apidae. So they're apids. Other familiar apids are honeybees and carpenter bees. And then a lot of other solitary bees are part of this family. All bumblebees are part of the genus Bombus. So if you hear the word Bombus, we know that we're talking about a bumblebee. There are around 250 species worldwide and about 50, just under 50 in North America, and 19 have been documented in Utah. But those numbers are different depending on which taxonomist you're talking to. There's people call them splitters and groupers, right? Like these two should be separate species, these two should be put together. There might be a cryptic species, and DNA analysis is really informing this work. So that species thing is kind of hard, and depending on which source you look at, you might get some different numbers. Bumblebees are known to be the most diverse in cool montane environments. They're in temperate regions of the world. And then if you look at the United States, there are bumblebees all across the US, but the most diversity is in the mountain areas of the West and like the mountain coastal areas of the Pacific coast. So again, Utah is a great place to be learning about bumblebees as well because of those montane environments and how we have just different ranges of different bumblebee species overlapping here. When I talk about my job and my passion for bumblebees, almost always people start telling me stories about honeybees. And so I like to just take a little bit of time and do a little compare and contrast about why they're both important and how they're very, very different. So both bumblebees and honeybees are excellent pollinators. I mentioned they're both apids in the family Apidae, and they both carry their pollen in the same way on that corbicula pollen basket on their back leg. And they both live in colonies. So the classic honeybee colony that we learned about when we were little, there's a lot of children's books and lots of decor, lots of different things about honeybees. There's the queen bee, and then they have the workers that are all female, and then the males for reproduction. That's true of bumblebees as well. They also have that colony structure, but that's different from many of our other, most of our other native bees. Um, as I mentioned, there are approximately 50 species of bumblebees in North America. And when we talk about honeybees, they're almost all one species. We're talking about usually when we're talking about beekeepers and honeybees that are pollinating large farms, those are European honeybees, and there can be different breeds of those European honeybees, but they're all one species. Bumblebees are native to North America and they're wild. While honeybees are not native to North America, they were brought here by colonists from Europe, and they mostly live in managed hives. Sometimes the honeybees will swarm and there could be a feral colony, but when we typically think about honeybees, that they are in managed hives, and they're agricultural. They're an agricultural tool. Some even kind of compare them to cows. I've heard other people compare like wild bees and honeybees to birds and chickens. Like if you are an ornithologist, if you are a birder, you want to go out and look for birds in the wild, you might put up a bird feeder in your backyard to see what wild birds come. Those are the native bees. That's like the bumblebees. And then you might have chickens in your yard, which are also birds, but they're there because maybe you want the eggs, maybe you want the meat. You're taking care of them and they're providing something for you. That's what the honeybees are in the bee world. They're like the chickens of the bee world. We take care of them. They provide a service for us, pollination, honey, wax. Both bumblebees and honeybees are really good pollinators. Honeybees are hugely important in US agricultural practices because their hives can be so big. At the peak of summer, 50 to 80,000 bees can be in one colony. And so they can pollinate a lot of crops very quickly. And because they live in these hives, they're able to be moved around. And that has become part of some like large farming practices, is that bees are moved around to pollinate different crops at different times. Where bumblebees are place-based, they're wild. They are excellent pollinators of crops and native plants, and sometimes they're actually more efficient pollinators than honeybees for certain plants. Honeybees are not easy to keep. There's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of pathogens. There's mites. So you have to do a lot of work to keep honeybees hives healthy, but they are not endangered. In 2023, there was 2.7 million hives of honeybees in the United States. On the other hand, we know that 25% of North American bumblebee species have shrinking ranges, shrinking populations. They're facing some level of threat, some possibility of extinction in the future. So why are we focusing on bumblebees? So part of this is we want to raise awareness about the diversity of pollinators and the importance of pollinators and our native pollinators. We also want to take action to help our bumblebees. And so we're using community science with the Bumblebee Atlas to do that. And bumblebees are a great animal for community science because they're charismatic and easily recognizable. Almost everybody knows what a bumblebee is, like especially when you see the queens in the spring, big old fuzzy noisy bees flying around. And they're charismatic. Like I mentioned at the beginning, they're an easy sell. Like this picture here, I love it so much. This is a male Western bumblebee, and he's got a little orange mustache there, and I think they're so adorable. And so it's really easy to get people to start to love them as they learn more and get to see them up close. Bumblebees have unique and interesting adaptations that make them interesting to learn about, fun to learn about, but also really important as pollinators. They're active from early spring until late fall, so there's lots of chances throughout the season to observe them, lots of opportunity to study them. And then also, there's a little bit of the threat that's inherent in that because that means that the colonies have to survive from early spring until late fall, so they're susceptible to any environmental challenges at any point in that cycle. And like I mentioned, we know that our bumblebee populations, some of them are in decline, and so we want to take action to help them, and anything that we do to benefit bumblebees as far as protecting them, providing habitat, is going to help other pollinators, native bees, butterflies, all those other pollinators as well. So let's talk about some of these unique adaptations, bumblebee biology. So just like honeybees, bumblebees are have a colony. So there is one queen who is the reproductive of the hive, the only one that is laying eggs. And then there are multiple worker generations that come out in the colony throughout the season, and those are all daughters of the queen and sisters of each other. Then there are males that are short-lived in the colony, and they are primarily for reproduction. Bumblebees go through complete metamorphosis, just like a butterfly. So they start life as an egg, looks like a little grain of rice. That egg will hatch and it'll be a larva, kind of a grub-looking thing. It will feed and grow at that larval stage, and then transform into a pupa where it will change its whole body and emerge as an adult. This picture is what a bumblebee nest looks like. If you know what honeybee nests look like, honeybee hives look like, with their beautiful structures, their hexagons, this kind of looks like a kind of a hot mess here. But this is what it actually looks like. Here's the queen right there, so that she's larger than the workers. All of these other are her workers, her daughters. They're all sisters of each other. And then all of this kind of yellow brown is wax, and they can secrete that wax, and they form these different structures. Some of these you can see it looks like there's honey in that. They do produce some honey, not to the level of honeybees, but they do have some honey. And then these sealed cells is where the egg, the larva, the pupa are developing. So they'll have pollen and nectar in there, and that's where the new bees are developing. These nests are typically found underground in abandoned rodent burrows or places where maybe a tree root rotted out. There's a lot we don't know about bumblebee nests. They're not easy to find. And with so many different species, they're not all the same. And so there's just a lot of work still to be done in understanding bumblebee nests. But they can also nest, some of them we do know also nest above ground, in bunch grasses perhaps, or sometimes even in human structures. They've been known to have nests in birdhouses, or if they find a little hole in your attic, in the insulation, or sometimes in a garage. So they will nest in some sort of cavity that they discover. They won't dig they won't dig a hole for their nest, but they'll find an abandoned hole that they will use for their nesting. Bumblebees will typically forage 275 to 750 meters from their nest. That's up to about half a mile. They're going to stay as close as possible to get the resources that they need as a way to save energy, though they can fly further if they needed to, but they're going to stay as close as possible. Something that's pretty unique about bumblebees is their nest cycle. An individual worker bumblebee might have a lifespan of a few weeks. The queens have a lifespan of 1 year, and that coincides with this nest cycle. Each year, nests start from scratch, and they finish by the end of the summer, and it starts over every year, and this is very unique in the bee world. So I'm going to just walk you through this nest cycle. In the winter, the queens are hibernating. They're not in a colony, they're not in a nest. It's just an individual bumblebee that's buried a couple inches deep in soil, under leaf litter, possibly in compost pile, in pine needle duff. They found someplace just a little bit deeper in the ground to protect themselves, and that's where they spend the winter in hibernation. When the temperature is warm and the flowers come out, those hibernating queens wake up and they start foraging. They're going to look for flowers because they need that nectar for energy. They need pollen for the nutrients and for their ovaries to finish developing. So you'll see these queens on early flowers that are blooming early in the spring. You'll also in the spring start to see these very large bumblebee queens. Queens are really big, and some species of queens are really big. But you'll start to see some nest searching behaviors where instead of visiting flowers, they're maybe flying low to the ground and then investigating different spaces. So maybe they'll go into a hole in the ground. Maybe they'll investigate an abandoned crevice in a rock. Maybe they'll go into a hollowed out log. They're searching for a place to start a nest. Once she finds that, and this is one queen working all on her own, once she finds a place, she's going to establish her nest there. So to do that, she will secrete wax and build herself a little honey pot. And in that, she'll put some nectar that she's going to use to sustain herself for the next couple weeks. Then she'll build other cells that she'll provision with pollen and nectar and lay an egg on that. And then just like a bird, she'll sit on that and incubate them and keep them warm. Those are the first generation of workers. So she'll drink out of her honey pot, she'll sit there and keep them warm until they emerge. Once that first generation of workers emerge, the queen never leaves the nest. Her sole job is laying eggs at that point. She's just there for reproduction, and her daughters will take over the work of the colony. They'll do the foraging, they'll take care of cleaning up the nest, provisioning those cells for the offspring. They'll take care of all of that work. And there will be multiple generations of her daughters that are emerged from that nest throughout the summer. Later in the summer into the fall, the nest will switch production, and instead of more workers, the reproductives are going to emerge from that colony. So that's next year's queens and males. They will leave the nest and they will go foraging. You'll see new queens and males out on the flowers in the late summer and fall. They will mate. The female, that queen, can store the sperm in her body until next spring, and then she'll go find a place to hibernate. The males will all die after that mating has happened. The foundress queen, the original queen, will die at the end of that summer. All of the workers will die. The only ones from this colony to survive are next year's queens. If they survive the winter, they'll start the whole process again. They will not go back to the same colony. They will start from scratch the following spring. What I just described is the normal process, the quote unquote normal life cycle, nest cycle of bumblebees. But there is a subgroup of bumblebees that have a different life strategy, which are the cuckoo bumblebees. And here there are no workers in cuckoo bumblebee species. There's only females and males, no workers. These females will emerge from hibernation later in the season. They don't emerge until the nests of their hosts are already established. The other bumblebees have already established the nest. And then she will seek out a nest, but not for creating a nest. She's seeking it out to take it over. She will usurp or kill the host queen, and then trick the host workers into taking care of her offspring instead of their genetic offspring that colony was founded with. By the end of summer, what will come out of that nest will be the females and males of the cuckoo bumblebee, not that host colony. Cuckoo bumblebees kind of stand out when you see them. They have big heads and strong mandibles, extra thin exoskeleton, and strong stingers, all for that ready for battle to go in and to take over a nest. But also the females do not have a pollen basket on the hind leg. If this was a regular bumblebee species, this hind leg would be concave, shiny with bristly hairs for carrying pollen. Cuckoo bumblebee queens don't ever go out foraging for pollen. They feed on pollen and nectar, and then they go into their host nest and the workers do all that work. So when we're identifying bumblebees, we look at that hind leg to figure out if it's a female of a regular bumblebee species or a cuckoo species. There are 3 species of cuckoo bumblebees that have ranges in Utah. The indiscriminate cuckoo bumblebee is the one that is most common. Fernald cuckoo bumblebee has been found in Utah, but it's a little bit more uncommon. And the Suckly cuckoo bumblebee is really rare. It has been ranked as critically endangered. It has been recommended for an endangered listing by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It hasn't been seen in the United States for about 10 years. So that's one that's really rare. It'd be very exciting to find. So the life cycle of bumblebees is something that makes them really unique. Other adaptations that make them unique are pictured here. One is their ability to thermoregulate. They can warm up their bodies so that they can be active in cooler temperatures and wetter environments than other bees would be able to be active. They have strong thoracic flight muscles, so the big old muscles in their thorax. And then they basically shiver and warm themselves up. This means they can be active, pollinating earlier in the day, later in the day, earlier in the season and later in the season, and then also at higher altitudes and higher latitudes than other bees. So there are some species of bumblebees that are only known from high elevations, 9,000 feet or higher. There are some bumblebee species that are only known from polar regions. They're just known from way up north. And so for plants that live in those areas, these bumblebees are really important pollinators. Research has also been done on bumblebees and their learning and how they learn. And thinking about why is it important that bumblebees learn, think about how their colony has to go from early spring until late fall, and all the flowers are changing throughout that time. So their food source and how to get the food source out is constantly changing. They need to learn how to extract pollen and nectar from an ever-changing suite of flowers. So researchers have brought colonies into the lab to observe how they learn, and they do this by creating puzzles for bumblebees. So one puzzle was they had bumblebees try to push a ball into a hole. It was almost like bumblebees playing billiards, and they did that, and then they got a nectar reward. What's pictured here is a puzzle where the bumblebees had to push either this blue paddle or this red paddle to make these discs spin and then expose a nectar reward. And what they learned is that the puzzles would be hard for the bumblebees. They might be able to figure it out, but it would take a long time, and sometimes they just didn't. But if they saw another bee solve the puzzle, then they could do it quickly. And they also tended to follow the actions of their colony mates more than bumblebees of a different colony. So social learning seems to be really important in these social insects. And then along with this, excuse me, some of the bumblebees in these studies, the researchers pulled the ball and the hole part of the puzzle away from the nectar reward to see what would happen. And some of the bumblebees would actually go and just push the ball around without getting a nectar reward, which made them question, are they doing this for fun? Are they playing? So just really interesting to learn about the intelligence of these tiny animals, and that maybe for many years we haven't given them enough credit for their ability to learn and solve problems, and just thinking about what they can accomplish in a season. They have to be able to adapt very quickly. And then finally, bumblebees are really important because they are able to buzz pollinate. There are other native bees that can do this behavior, but honeybees can't and many other bees can't. So some types of flowers like peppers and tomatoes have the pollen in these poricidal anthers. And for the pollen to get extracted, it needs to be vibrated. So this bumblebee is grabbing on with her legs and her mandibles. She's vibrating her flight muscles in her thorax. And by doing that, she's just rattling the pollen out. You can see it's kind of spewing out there, lands on her body, and then she can broom it down and put it into her pollen basket. You can hear this behavior when bumblebees are flying. It's a low sound like zzz. And when they're buzz pollinating, it's a higher pitch like zzz, zzz. And so it's kind of a fun thing if you see them in your garden to watch for that. It's fun to notice and to observe. So those are things that are like interesting and what makes bumblebees really important and so fascinating. But we do have some conservation concerns around bumblebee populations, bumblebee ranges. And this work kind of started in the late 20th century, like the 1990s or so, when researchers really started to notice that common bumblebee species were not so common anymore. The IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, created a bumblebee specialist group, and they went through the work of doing species status assessments for all of the bumblebees of North America, looking at historic records, current ranges, all the data they could find to assess what is their risk of going extinct. This graph is showing the results of that were published about 10 years ago. 28 of those species are in this green category, which is great. Those are the species of least concern. They seem to be stable. They seem to be okay. 5 species were classified as data deficient. These are some of those rare species that there just wasn't enough information to make an assessment. But what really stood out to that group and to researchers since then is this 25% that are in these red and orange categories. That 25% of our bumblebee species here in North America are facing some risk of extinction. In Utah, that translates to four of our species. The western bumblebee, the American bumblebee, Morrison's bumblebee, and the Suckly cuckoo bumblebee. These are all in one of those categories. Vulnerable for the first three, critically endangered for the Suckly cuckoo. And all of these species have been petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. Those decisions are pending. Like I mentioned, in January, the Suckly cuckoo bumblebee was recommended for an endangered listing, and it's just going through the review process right now, which could take months. So the question is, what's causing that? And there is no one answer. There's a lot of different things in the environment that are working against our bumblebee species and their health. One of the big ones is habitat loss and fragmentation. Bumblebees need food, which is flowers, and they need places to nest and they need places to overwinter. And a lot of human landscapes don't have that for them. If you think about cities, roads, large farms, even suburbs, that's just missing the habitat that they need to survive. Bumblebees can get sick just like every other animal, so there are pathogens that can spread through wild bee populations, and there is evidence that some of those pathogens come from commercial bees. So honeybees can bring pathogens to wild bee populations, but also some bumblebees. There are some bumblebee species that are reared in commercial facilities and then sent out to greenhouses for pollination, and they sometimes can escape those greenhouse settings and then they can spread their pathogens to species in the wild. Pesticides is another one. There's a lot of chemicals in our environment. And when you are an animal that feeds on flowers, feeds on plants, and lives in the ground, that amount of spraying can be really detrimental. And even if it doesn't kill the bumblebees, it can make them not as healthy, not as able to fight off pathogens, maybe not as able to reproduce as much. And all the different pesticides can affect them, herbicides, fungicides, and then especially insecticides. Commercial honeybee competition is also a big one. So I mentioned that honeybees are not native and their colonies can be huge. 50 to 80,000 individuals in one hive at the peak of summer. When you're in an area that has limited resources especially, honeybee hive can easily outcompete the bumblebees and other native bees. So that is definitely a factor affecting our bumblebees. And then climate change, as temperatures rise, bumblebees prefer cooler, more temperate environment. They're less able to forage when it gets really hot. When there's drought, then there's a lack of flowers. When there's storms and fires, all of those things can affect our bumblebee populations. The good news about this is that this is not one of those problems that's like, oh man, it's so sad and there's nothing I can do to help. This is one of those where everyone can help. Bumblebees need food and shelter. So you can feed them by planting flowers and making sure there's a variety of bloom times so that when the queens emerge in spring, there's flowers. When the workers are foraging all through the summer, there's flowers. When those new queens are emerging and preparing for hibernation, there's flowers. So really thinking about a variety of bloom times. Also providing habitat for nesting and overwintering. That just usually means letting a little bit of your garden or yard be a little bit more wild, a little less tidy is going to create those kinds of spaces. And then also thinking about connectivity. Our bumblebee populations need to be able to, a colony needs to find another colony so there can be genetic flow, so the genes they don't get inbred. And so thinking about, advocating in communities when thinking about where can there be pollinator gardens? How can we connect different habitats? And then also thinking about our public lands and how we can protect pollinator habitat in our public lands. Rethinking about pesticide use, the best habitat for pollinators is chemical free. So if and how and when to use those pesticides are really important things to consider. And then our bumblebees and all of our pollinators need advocates, people to speak up for them, share what you know about their diversity, their importance, and what they need. This is where the Xerces Society is pretty helpful with a lot of publications. We have native plant guides for all the different regions of the country, and it lists the plants, their bloom time, the sun, soil, all of that, and then kind of tells you what types of pollinators you can expect. These are really great resources. Of course, like Native Plant Society, you are great resources for each other. Master gardener groups, extension offices, native plant nurseries. There's a lot of resources to help find the plants that bumblebees and other pollinators can use. The Xerces Society also has this publication. This is a small booklet that talks about how to create nesting and overwintering habitat. It's not specifically for bumblebees, but bumblebees are included. It's for pollinators and other beneficial insects. So thinking about what do all of these beneficial insects, including native bees, need. So it walks through these different points of saving the stems, leaving the leaves, redefining what a perfect lawn looks like, thinking about how you use mulch, saving a snag, that's a typo, I'm sorry about that, a snag and plant a log, brush piles, or rock walls, providing water source, and then sharing what you're doing with a habitat sign. All of those things are helpful for creating habitat for bumblebees and other native pollinators. And like I said, Xerces has a ton of resources. A lot of things are free on our website. There's books that you can purchase. There's also videos, and there's a blog, and there's a podcast. There's just a lot of resources. So if you haven't checked out the Xerces Society and are looking for something, it's a good place to start. The other thing that bumblebees need is if we want to help them, if we want to prioritize our conservation actions, like choose where and when to focus our conservation actions, we actually need more data. There's a lot that we don't know about bumblebees, including where they currently are and which habitats they're using. Bumblebees are small animals and their species have large ranges, and we are living in some very large western states. So if we want to prioritize conservation actions, we need to know where are they, what habitats are they using, and what flowers are they depending on. And this is where the Bumblebee Atlas comes in. Bumblebee Atlas is conservation through community science. This is a true community science project where we invite anybody that's interested to join us and to get trained in being a volunteer. And you can go out and help us find, photograph, and ultimately map our native bumblebee species. This project launched in 2024, and the Mountain States Bumblebee Atlas covers Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. This is one of many projects that Xerces has, different Bumblebee Atlas projects. We have Bumblebee Atlas projects in 20 different states as of last summer. And so we're just looking for volunteers to be trained on going out, and we train volunteers to actually catch bumblebees in nets, put them in vials, put them on ice to chill them, but it doesn't hurt them. Take really good pictures of them so we can identify them from pictures without having to harm them. And then they get released back into the environment, and the pictures get sent to us where we can identify them, mark their location, and figure out which species are where. Across the 4 states of our project area, there are 30 different species that are possible based on historic records and ranges of our bumblebees. So that's a lot of diversity, and we don't know the details of the life histories and the ranges of all of these bees yet. This is what we knew when the project began. Those are, again, the 4 states of the project, and each of those dots is a bumblebee observation since the year 2000. By looking at this map, you'd think, oh wow, bumblebees really love cities. Like there's the Salt Lake City metro area, there's Denver and the Front Range. Oh, I can see where Reno is. So a lot of our data are biased towards where people are, because where people are, that's where there's records of bumblebees. And what we want to do is find out across the whole region, what's happening in these gaps, which species are where, and what habitats are they using, so then we can figure out what can we do to help preserve those landscapes. And a lot of these observations on this map are going to be common species. We really want to find where our conservation target species are. So this is collaborative data gathering is what the Bumblebee Atlas is. We're doing this on a large regional scale. And the other thing that's pretty important is that we teach our volunteers a standardized protocol. So we know that everybody is going out and collecting bumblebees in the same way. It's 45 minutes of search time in a 1 hectare space. And that way we have this baseline data that can be used to track and monitor populations in the future because we're recording the effort. If I look at a record on iNaturalist, that can be really important information. It tells me what species is where, maybe what flower it's on, but that doesn't tell me if that volunteer spent all day looking for that one bee, or if that was one of 100 bees that was there. And so by having this standardized protocol, it helps us to know a little bit about abundance of the bumblebees, and so we can use that as we move forward. We're engaging citizens and we're working with different federal, state, local partners. We have biologists with the BLM, biologists with the Forest Service, state biologists, different nonprofits are all engaging in this work and partnering with us to train volunteers and to go out and gather these data. And so, as I mentioned, we have 3 key questions. Where are our bumblebee species found right now? What habitats are they using? And which flowers are they relying on? That's what we need in order to move forward and make informed conservation decisions in the future. This work could not be done without volunteers. If I tried to go out and gather the amount of data that we bring in, it would take me years or decades to do this work. So we train volunteers, and by doing that, we get to connect with our community members, connect with our neighbors, teach about the importance of pollinators, and introduce a wide variety of people to these really important, beautiful animals that are right in our backyards. You can see a lot of smiles in those pictures. It's also pretty fun to go out and do this work. So this is what it takes to become a volunteer. So our volunteers first get trained. Since we are sending volunteers out to catch bumblebees in nets and take pictures of them, we want them to be confident and safe when they're doing that. And to be able to follow our standardized protocol. So we ask our volunteers to meet a minimum training requirement, which is watching a live or recorded training webinar, reading through the pretty in-depth participant handbook, or attending a full day in-person workshop. All 3 of these are 3 methods of getting the same information. A lot of our volunteers kind of mix and match and use all of them, take all as many opportunities to gather knowledge as they can and build their confidence. After volunteers get trained, that we ask them to adopt a grid cell. We've divided the 4 states of our region into 50 by 50 kilometer grid cells. Our goal is to have at least 2 surveys done in every one of these grid cells. And by adopting a grid cell, a volunteer is saying, I will go and do 2 surveys in that grid cell this summer during the survey window. The colors of this map show different survey windows. So the blue starts in April, the yellow start in May, and the purple start in June. We have a great diversity of climate across our region, so we're trying to match up the timing of the flowers and the bees with our survey times. The best part, most fun part, is conducting the surveys. So our volunteers go out and follow our protocol to net, vial, chill bumblebees. I know that seems a little weird, putting them into a cooler on ice, but this provides a chance for us to do this work without having to kill and pin bumblebees to study them. We can actually identify bumblebees from pictures if we have good pictures. And so we teach our volunteers what angles do we need to see in order to identify that bumblebee to species. And it's like we can get those pictures the best if the bee is immobilized. So that's what the ice does. And it just takes them a couple minutes to warm up. You usually have like 5 to 7 minutes to take pictures pretty quickly of that bee before it warms up and flies away. Then the pictures that the volunteer takes, along with information from a brief habitat assessment, gets uploaded to bumblebeewatch.org. This is our data management website where they can go in and add sightings or explore sightings of others. They can look at maps to show where different species have been recorded, and then volunteers can track their own contributions. This is a screenshot of mine. So these are the species that I have found. Here's a list of the surveys that I've done. So it's this great tool where you can track your own personal contribution to bumblebee conservation. In our first year, this is what we accomplished. 68 grid cells were adopted, 177 surveys were done, over 800 observations, found 21 species, and 4 of those were our species of conservation concern, which was a great first year. We're really excited because we know that we have more volunteers ready to go, more people are learning and hearing about the Atlas and are ready to join. So we're really excited to expand this effort into some of these less studied areas of our 4-state region. If you're interested in learning more about the Atlas or joining the Atlas, you are welcome to join. We're always looking for more passionate volunteers to join this awesome Bumblebee community. This QR code will take you to our website. You can also go to bumblebeeatlas.org. That is the website for all of our Atlas projects. You can go to Find My Atlas under Get Involved and look for the mountain states, and that's where you'll find region-specific information. There is a training webinar scheduled for April 23rd. So if you think you might want to volunteer, you can register for that. If you go to the Bumblebee Atlas website and go to events, there's a place for you to register there. There was already a training webinar on March 11th, and that was recorded, and the recording is posted on the website. So if you're not able to attend this one in person, you could watch the recording to get the training that you need. And then I'm going to have a very busy spring and summer of traveling around for different in-person events. A lot of times people will watch a training recording or read the participant handbook, and they're not really confident going out to do a survey until they've done it with somebody or had a chance to practice. And that's what field trainings are. They're hands-on practice of I put a net in your hand, give you some vials, and we go out and look for bumblebees and practice netting them, practice getting them into vials, chilling them, and taking pictures. It's a great way to see bumblebees up close, to learn the protocols, to connect with other volunteers. And then you can see that there are some workshops that are scheduled. These are full day trainings that goes into a little bit of biology, conservation, and then walk step by step through how to be a volunteer. In the Salt Lake City area, we have an event planned hosted by the Utah Native Plant Society on Sunday, May 4th at Tracy Aviary in Liberty Park. I'm really excited to be in your area and to do this work. Thanks to Parker for all of your work on getting this organized and the beautiful artwork. So that's something close by if you're in the Salt Lake City area for you to check out. That's on a Sunday. The following Saturday, we're partnering with the Sageland Collaborative, Utah Pollinator Pursuit, and doing a joint training of Utah Pollinator Pursuit work and then the Bumblebee Atlas. And that's going to be on May 10th. So that would be a training webinar. So that's another one that you could check out. You can register for any of those events by going to bumblebeeatlas.org or finding other events as they are scheduled. You can RSVP to any of those. This is our website. This is an email address that comes to me, and my role is to answer questions, help train people, share my love of bumblebees, and to share the importance of them with the community. So I was happy to be here. I appreciate all of your attention and your time. And with any time that we have, which is not a ton, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have. I'm gonna see if there was some in the chat. Oh, I see. Thanks, Marcus. The Downtown Library has a copy of the Xerces Attracting Native Pollinators book. I love when I see that they're in the libraries. That's great. What types of plant families do bumblebees enjoy? Do they have a favorite plant? That's a great question. Bumblebees are generalists. So there are some bees that will only focus on one genus or one family. But bumblebees will feed on a lot of different plants, which is good since the plants are constantly changing. I bet some of you avid gardeners are going to have some ideas of some of those plants that you always see bumblebees on. And different species can be a little bit different. Like if you're out at a site in a wild space and there's different flowers in bloom, you might find different species of bumblebees on different flowers. Some of them have longer tongues, some of them have shorter tongues. But there's a lot of different flowers that they will visit. And some of the Xerces favorites are listed on those plant lists that I shared earlier. Thanks, Zach, for sharing those links. That is awesome. And my email address is all in the chat. That's fantastic. Minimum age to be a volunteer. When you adopt a grid cell, there is a place for you to certify that you're 18 years or older or are registering with a guardian. So we do have some middle schoolers and high schoolers that are interested, and we just ask their parents to be part of that, to support them, to supervise them. So 18 is the minimum age, but we invite younger kids with an adult. Yeah, so it would be, I taught middle school. I like kids love entomology work and they are fascinated. So if you have a daughter that wants to be an entomologist, this would be a great project to engage her and to just help her kind of get up close and personal and do authentic scientific research. That's beautiful. Zach asked if there are grid cells in Utah that would be more important to adopt. The answer is yes. I don't know if you noticed on the map, but there was darker colors and lighter colors of all of those three colors. The darker shades are our priority grid cells. Those are grid cells where we don't have as much historic data. The lighter colors are going to be the lower priority grid cells. So 75% of our grid cells are prioritized. I'm trying to get our volunteers to move away from those population centers. In Utah, there's big wide open gaps, especially in the western deserts. You think about places that people typically haven't gone. Those are going to be the places that we need data, but we will take data from any grid cell. And if you are really looking for some place, like I really want to go where I know nobody else is going to go, you could send me an email and I can tell you which grid cells have not yet been adopted. I could tell you which grid cells have zero Bombus records ever. So I'd be happy to share that information. It's constantly changing because people are actively adopting grid cells these days. You're welcome, Mitchell. Thanks. Thank you for your appreciation. Are honeybees able to feed on all plants indiscriminately while native bees are restricted to certain plants? Honeybees are generalists. Many bees are also generalists, but there are also many native bees that are specialists that are restricted to a certain plant. That could be a species, it could be a genus, it could be a family. So the answer is kind of yes and no. Some bees are definitely specialists restricted to certain plants. Honeybees are generalists, but there are other native bees that are generalists as well. Marcus says, from my very limited research, I've seen that most bumblebees are generalist pollinators. Yeah. Bumblebees are like all of them are generalists as far as we know. Yep. Thanks, Marcus. Ooh, is there a good dichotomous key for Utah bees? Awesome question, Zach. There is a professor at Southern Utah University that is working on a dichotomous key for the most common species in Utah. They sent me a copy just last week, and they're really close to finishing, and they're super excited to share that with their community, the bee-loving community in Utah. So there will be one soon. The other one that I would recommend for Utah was published, I want to say 2012 by the Forest Service. It is the bumblebees of the Western North America. And that is a really great key. John Koch, who is from the Bee Lab in Logan, Utah, was one of the authors on that. So that's the other one that I would recommend for Utah. So a dichotomous key is a tool that you use to identify a bumblebee to species. It's a series of questions that are all in pairs. It's like a choose your own adventure. So you have your bee and you look at two options. Is your bee this one or this one? And then you go to like question 2 or question 4, and it helps you know what to look at in order to identify your bumblebee to species. So that's what a dichotomous key is. And Zach, thank you. Just put the link for that Western Bumblebees guide into the chat. What's the best practice to prevent CCD, colony collapse disorder? I am not qualified to answer that. That's a honeybee thing, and I am not a beekeeper. I don't have a lot of knowledge of that. So I'm sure that there are other beekeeping experts that could better answer that question than I can. I would say, like, for all of our bees, all of our native bees, habitat is really important. good diversity of food, pesticide-free spaces, nesting, overwintering sites is what we can do to help all of our bees. Ooh, Marcus, do I have a favorite bumblebee species? And that's a great question. When I started falling in love with bumblebees, I was in northwestern Montana, and there are some higher elevation forest bumblebees that are there that have like black and yellow kind of mixed together. One of them is called the fuzzy-horned bumblebee, and one of them is called the black-tailed bumblebee. I would say those two are my favorite, probably because those were the first ones that I learned. So Mitchell, I know that pathogens are spreading to native bees. I don't know specifically about CCD. So pathogens from honeybees are definitely spreading to natives, but the other part I don't have knowledge to share with you. Beautiful, great questions.